Forests are supposed to help slow climate change. Trees absorb carbon dioxide, store carbon in wood, and can keep that carbon locked away for decades or even centuries. But new research from Brazil suggests that some forests are gradually losing this ability, even when they have not been completely cleared. Scientists followed 49 tropical and subtropical forest sites across southeastern and southern Brazil for years, repeatedly measuring the trees growing inside them. The result revealed two changes happening at the same time. The forests were becoming less effective at accumulating above-ground carbon, and their tree communities were becoming increasingly similar to one another. The researchers described this as long-term taxonomic, functional, and phylogenetic homogenization. In simpler terms, forests that once contained more distinct combinations of species and ecological strategies are gradually becoming more alike. That combination matters because a forest is not just a collection of trunks storing carbon. Different tree species use water differently, grow at different speeds, tolerate drought differently, build wood of different densities, and survive for different lengths of time. When the composition of a forest changes, the way that forest processes and stores carbon can change with it. The study examined permanent forest plots where individual trees had been measured repeatedly over long periods. Researchers tracked how much above-ground carbon was gained as surviving trees grew and new trees entered the measured population, and how much was lost when trees died. That distinction is critical. A forest can still contain a huge amount of carbon while its ability to absorb additional carbon is weakening. A large bank account can still be large even if the deposits are getting smaller every year. Across the 49 sites, the long-term carbon sink declined. The forests were still storing enormous quantities of carbon in their existing biomass, but the balance between carbon gains and carbon losses was shifting in an unfavorable direction. This is different from deforestation. When a forest is cleared, the carbon consequences are immediate and visually obvious. Trees disappear, biomass is burned or decomposes, and much of the stored carbon eventually returns to the atmosphere. A weakening forest carbon sink is much harder to see. The forest may still look green from a satellite. Trees still cover the landscape. New leaves appear every year. But inside that apparently intact ecosystem, growth and mortality can slowly change until the forest absorbs less carbon than it once did. Eventually, under some conditions, a forest can cross from being a carbon sink to being a carbon source. That possibility has become a major concern across tropical forests. The new Brazilian study does not claim that every monitored site has already become a net source, but it adds evidence that the overall sink is declining and that changes in tree community structure are part of the story. The researchers found something especially interesting when they looked at tree strategies. Ecologists often place plants along a rough spectrum between fast and slow lifestyles. Some species grow quickly, capture resources aggressively, produce relatively cheap tissues, and turn over faster. Others use a more conservative strategy. They grow more slowly, invest in dense wood and durable tissues, use resources carefully, and often survive longer. The Brazilian forests containing more conservative species tended to show greater carbon gains and lower carbon losses. Imagine building two warehouses. One is filled quickly using lightweight materials. It expands fast, but parts need frequent replacement. The other grows more slowly but is built from heavier, durable material that remains standing for much longer. A forest dominated by long-lived dense wood species can store carbon in a similar way. Carbon accumulates more slowly in individual trees, but it can remain locked in living biomass for longer because mortality is lower. This helps explain why carbon storage depends on much more than how fast trees grow. A rapidly growing tree can absorb carbon quickly, but if it dies young and decomposes, much of that carbon returns to the atmosphere. A slower tree that survives for centuries may provide more stable long-term storage. The researchers also found that more homogeneous forests tended to experience lower carbon losses. At first, that may sound positive. If homogenization means lower mortality, why worry about diversity disappearing? Because ecological stability is not determined by one measurement. A forest dominated by a smaller set of successful species may temporarily maintain carbon more efficiently under current conditions, while simultaneously becoming less diverse and potentially less resilient to future disturbances. Diversity can provide something similar to insurance. If drought harms one group of species, others may perform better. If a new pest attacks one type of tree, unrelated species may survive. Different root depths, leaf traits, and growth strategies allow an ecosystem to respond to environmental stress in different ways. As communities become more similar, some of that ecological redundancy may disappear. The study detected declines not only in the number and identity of species, but also in functional and phylogenetic diversity. Functional homogenization means the surviving trees increasingly share similar ecological traits. Phylogenetic homogenization means the communities are becoming more dominated by closely related evolutionary lineages. This can happen without dramatic forest destruction. Environmental filters gradually favor species able to tolerate modern conditions. Heat, drought, fragmented landscapes, altered fire regimes, pollution, invasive species, and human disturbance can remove sensitive species while allowing a smaller group of tolerant species to persist or expand. Over decades, different forests may begin converging towards similar communities. The researchers described their dataset as a baseline for understanding how above-ground carbon sinks may respond as climate change continues in southeastern and southern Brazil. The sites cover tropical and subtropical forests rather than the entire Brazilian Amazon, so the results should not simply be treated as a measurement of all Brazilian forests. That distinction matters because Brazil contains several enormous and ecologically different forest systems. The Amazon receives much more global attention, but the Atlantic forest and other tropical and subtropical forests also store carbon, support exceptional biodiversity, regulate water, and occupy landscapes heavily modified by agriculture and cities. Many of these forests survive as fragments. Fragmentation changes environmental conditions near forest edges. Sunlight penetrates farther, wind increases, humidity can decline, temperatures fluctuate more strongly. Large trees near exposed edges may become more vulnerable to drought or wind damage. Over time, these pressures can influence which species survive. Climate adds another layer. Warmer temperatures increase atmospheric demand for water. During drought, trees can close the pores in their leaves to reduce water loss, but that also reduces carbon dioxide uptake and photosynthesis. Extreme drought can damage water transport inside trunks and branches, eventually causing mortality. Large trees are especially important because they contain disproportionate amounts of carbon. Losing one massive old tree can erase years of carbon accumulation by many smaller trees. This is why a carbon sink can weaken even if young trees continue growing. The forest is constantly running two competing processes. Growth adds carbon, while mortality removes living biomass. The net sink is whatever remains after those processes are balanced against one another. If growth slows slightly while mortality rises slightly, the difference can collapse. And because tropical forests exchange so much carbon with the atmosphere, relatively small changes spread across large areas can become climatically important. The new research arrives at an interesting moment for Brazil. Deforestation has declined nationally in recent years. Data reported for 2025 showed a roughly 20% reduction in native vegetation clearing compared with 2024, including decreases in major biomes such as the Amazon. That is important progress because preventing forest destruction remains one of the most direct ways to protect stored carbon. But stopping deforestation solves only part of the problem. A forest that remains standing still needs to remain healthy enough to function as an ecosystem. If warming, drought, fragmentation, fire, and biological homogenization gradually reduce its capacity to absorb carbon, climate models cannot simply count every hectare of existing forest as an unchanged carbon sink. This creates a difficult problem for climate policy. Countries often include forests in carbon budgets because growing vegetation removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. If that natural removal weakens, achieving the same atmospheric outcome requires larger reductions in human emissions. A declining natural sink is like losing part of a discount you expected to receive every year. The emissions themselves do not need to increase for atmospheric carbon dioxide to rise faster. Nature simply has to remove less of what humans release. The study also complicates the common assumption that maximum biodiversity and maximum short-term carbon storage will always occur together. Ecological relationships are rarely that simple. The researchers found that forests dominated by conservative traits showed stronger carbon performance, while homogenized forests sometimes experience lower carbon losses. But biodiversity has values extending far beyond immediate carbon accumulation. Species diversity supports pollination, nutrient cycling, food webs, disease resistance, genetic resources, and the capacity to adapt to future conditions. A forest optimized around only one metric could become fragile in ways that metric does not capture. That is why long-term monitoring is so valuable. A satellite can show whether forest cover remains. A single field survey can estimate how much carbon is standing today. But only repeated measurements reveal whether individual trees are growing faster, dying more often, being replaced by different species, and changing the ecosystem over decades. The 49 Brazilian monitoring sites effectively act like medical records for forests. One measurement tells you the current condition. Repeated measurements show the trajectory. And the trajectory is what concerns researchers. The forests are not disappearing overnight. Their internal composition is reorganizing while their capacity to accumulate above-ground carbon declines. That makes the discovery less dramatic visually than a wildfire or clear-cut forest, but potentially more important for understanding the future carbon cycle. The green canopy can remain, the trees can still stand, and yet the forest can quietly become less effective at doing one of the things humans increasingly depend on it to do. The question is no longer only how much forest remains. It is whether the forest that remains will continue behaving like the forest we thought we were protecting.